Hey, hey, family, and welcome back to another Own the Narrative Africa. Yes, you know who I am. My name is Winnie O. I am your host of this lovely live stream show here hosted at the Africa Engineering News platform. You can connect with us at www.africaengineeringnews.com. And also, if you're on the social medias, that's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, IG, all that good stuff, YouTube included, connect with us at Africa Engineering News. So simple to find us. And also take a couple of seconds, share, like, let your friends know we're on. Whether you're watching this live or later on demand, please be sure to share it with the next person, because you know what? You might learn something new. And that's really what I hope for all of us. Let's learn something new. As I put all my electronics on mute, right? Anywho, so if you have been catching the announcements all week about this Own the Narrative Africa session, we'll be talking about the importance of our Indigenous languages, especially across Africa, in context of STEM education and STEM awareness, in just STEM in general, right? Hence the title STEM for the culture, right? It is so important to make sure that we not only learn, right, these topics in whatever languages they're taught, but also make it relevant and relatable to our people wherever they are, especially if English or, whatever that other second language in Kenya is Kiswahili, if it's not available in those main languages, because people also tend to speak their mother tongue, our mother tongues. It's important. It's important to also tie that in back to these really technical spaces of professionalism, right? So this week, I will bring my guests here shortly, and I just wanted to do a quick intro of them. My first guest is Grace Kago. She is a Kenyan-American scientist with a bachelor's in biology and with a minor in art history, and she is currently a doctoral student in a cell and molecular biology program at the University of Texas. And her research work is primarily focused on using genetic and molecular biology tools to better understand how the body's stress responses can affect our overall health. Now, beyond being an amazing scientist, okay, step one, she's also an ardent supporter of increasing science literacy in our various languages, including African vernacular languages, to make science accessible and engaging to all. And obviously, she has a YouTube video that will be included in the comments section, so be sure to check that out. And her YouTube videos do come with English as well as Kiswahili subtitles, because she does them in Gikuyu, which is her mother tongue. So yeah, please support that. Support our efforts across the ether out here to help make our indigenous languages, as valued as any other communities' indigenous languages. My second guest today is Mr. Mohamed Cisse. He is a computer science and operations researcher. He obtained his PhD in computer science at the University of Tours in France. And, he is a hardworking, smart, intelligent, just immensely personable individual. You're going to love him. He is an expert in solving real-life planning and scheduling problems. But also beyond his research activities, Mohamed is the founder of Diaspora Scientists Federation, which is a network of African scientists to promote STEM education on the continent, and obviously throughout the diaspora. So with that, I will not keep you guys waiting any longer. We're gonna bring them right in. And so welcome, team. Welcome. How are you doing? Hello. So before we really get into it, I'll give us a couple comments to allow you guys to introduce yourselves once again and kind of let people know a little bit more about you guys. So we'll start with Grace and then Mohamed, please.
Cool. So hi, everyone. Thank you, Winnie, for hosting. Thank you, Winnie, for hosting me today. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So like Winnie said, I'm a grad student in a cell biology program. And so I care a lot about cells and microbes and all these little tiny organisms that impact our lives. So in addition to my science, I also care a lot about engaging people about science who might be marginalized across different languages. And so over the pandemic, one thing that stood out to me was that like when we were making all of these, not we, but like when many other scientists working on coronavirus were making all of these amazing discoveries about the coronavirus and about COVID disease, I noticed that there was like a really big gap between what we in the Western world were learning and what people who don't speak English were learning. Like for example, my grandparents specifically, they speak English, but their mother tongue is Gikuyu. And I remember thinking, I wonder like who is having these conversations in the language that they understand and that they're comfortable with. And so that led me to start a YouTube channel where I have those conversations about all these science things. And I made a video about COVID disease, and I made some others about vaccines, all in Gikuyu, usually with English subtitles and sometimes Kiswahili. I try very hard to include Swahili, but I'm not super fluent. So yeah, so that's what, and so in that kind of effort, I met Mohamed and I met Winnie, and so that's kind of how I found myself here.
Thank you so much for that. And Mohamed, go ahead and introduce.
Hey guys, my name is Mohamed Cisse. I'm from Guinea, a small West African country. So I grew up there, I do everything there. And then I went in France to study computer science and applied math. And on my side, I founded in 2017 with Rafiu Agoro, Togolese scientist, African Diaspora Scientific Federation. So we are trying just to build a network around the world of African scientists in order to bring technology and STEM to the African continent and create transfer of technology from the diaspora, the African diaspora, to the continent. And based on this initiative, I'm very, very, very interested on African languages, how we can really bring modernity and different modernity concept in those African languages. And I am very interested of African languages after reading several books about that field, mostly Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Cheikh Anta Diop. So Cheikh Anta Diop only wrote in French, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o has some interesting book in that topic. And yeah, they really taught me how important are our own languages. Yeah, definitely. So that's all for me.
Absolutely, and thank you so much. Listen, that was a great segue into just the whole topic of today, right? And understanding that it is just as important for us to be able to acknowledge the significance of science and STEM like innovations, right? And making them practical and understandable to those who may not necessarily have access to those more quote unquote general popular languages, right? And so even as before we got here on live, we were talking about also how other communities around the globe like are kind of now seeing this resurgence of the need to preserve Indigenous languages, especially in context of education and just as you said, also that modernization of linguistic context, right? Because it's a difference between necessarily saying we're modernizing versus we're westernizing, right? Because a lot of people tend to hesitate when you're like, oh, we're gonna westernize it, or oh, you're becoming really Western. I mean, and we've seen that even in the past when people gave up their language, because we know some people were not. It was not their choice to give up language, right? Because even as we talked about here in context of the stolen Africans to America, right, who were enslaved, it was not their choice to lose language. It was not their choice to lose culture, but that was a strategic thing that was done to strip them away from their motherlands, to strip them away from their sense of community, right? And so, even now, as we kind of see this resurgence of connecting back to the motherland, connecting back to how we communicate, in a more, I don't know, like in a more like mother tongue, like, so it's strange. There's a particular essence that comes with being able to talk to someone in a language that is familiar to them. Right, that it really touches to the root of something. When whether you're talking just about like everyday topics, or you're talking about something as important as medical advancements and scientific advancements, right, or historic events, right? Because that's what one of the things I love to do to share is a phrase my friend Dr. Campbell always says is how words matter, language matters, context matters. right? And we have to keep all those three things together in order to understand, okay, well, what are we talking about? Why are we talking about it? And how does this apply, or how does it connect with whoever we're trying to communicate with, right? And so, like, what's your take on that, first of all? You could start with Grace.
So I think generally, I guess I come at this honestly from a science point, since I work as a scientist. And I guess touching on your first point about modernity and Westernness always being synonymous. Is that the word? I don't know. When we talk about modernizing, we always say Western. And so I feel like whenever we have that type of conversation, I think I don't know, it's like a deficit way of thinking, of assuming that like African languages and African peoples before us, we assume that they didn't know or that they didn't understand what we know now as modern concepts, but we know that's not true. So like one example that I actually was thinking about, and my dad actually brought this up last week. So we were talking about the microbiome. And so for anyone that's not familiar, our guts, they function to participate in digestion, but inside them, there's a bunch of bacteria that have to be healthy and that are necessary for good digestive health. And so one of the things that the doctors recommend that you do, or one of the things that you need to do, is to always consume foods that have like probiotics in them and that have that help to provide nutrition for that part of your digestion process. And so anyway, so in the modern world right now, we have lots of probiotic pills. We are told to consume yogurt. We're told to not eat too much sugar. We're told to consume fiber. And so you might think, oh, that's just a modern discovery. But if you look back at, like, for example, in the Gikuyu culture, there's such a thing called fermented porridge. I think it's oshoromo gagatu, which is like fermented porridge. And is like a fermented food that is useful for maintenance of your probiotic or of your bacterial health, basically, right? And so, like, and now what do we do? We drink kombucha, we eat yogurt, we eat kimchi. You see, it's like, so this idea, and those cultures, the culture that where kimchi comes from, like they understand that in their livelihood in the same way that like the Gikuyu people used to drink fermented porridge, right? And I'm sure if you look at other tribal groups, like I'm sure if you look at your tribal groups, or your ethnic groups, we don't call them ethnic groups. When you look at each of your individual ethnic groups, you'll find those type of food groups and those type of like food processes that are directly related to specific health goals.
Right.
And so I don't know, that's just one example. So I guess even though we're only now understanding the role of eating fermented foods or eating yogurts and things, that was a thing that was done a long time ago. So
absolutely, like, and that's actually a really like practical example, right? Because people often think like, well, we talk about like it's these super deep concepts that like one cannot understand, but the reality is we're actually seeing that across the scientific, spectrum is really there's almost like this return back to the olden way of doing things, whether we're talking about environmental sustainability, over here we're talking about health and holistic health approaches, right? Going back to the understanding of like, hold up, maybe these like old people knew like what they were talking about, right? Because oftentimes science, what really science does is catches up to things or practices that indigenous cultures initially did, right? Even when we talk about farming processes, right? Indigenous cultures somehow, knew to do these things based on whatever, trials and errors that they went through, and to perfect it for their regions. And then, other cultures come in and say, no, you're wrong, do it my way. And then X years later, now they were like, oh my God, we are rediscovering that, maybe they were right. Maybe these herbs, there's something to them. Maybe there's acupuncture. Because even something that's such as acupuncture or massaging. Like I remember growing up, like there's a particular way that even like people like in my culture in Luo, like it's a thing. They're like, if you twisted your leg or whatever, there was a way that they would massage. It's called kurwayo. And I was like, I just knew that's what was done. Like if you're hurt, it was like, oh my God, they're gonna hurt you more. But it worked, right? And so, and now it's, there's a fancy medical term for it now, right? And that's part of like how language evolves. how we evolve our lexicon, right? And you mentioned this before in context of, just this modernization process, how oftentimes indigenous languages tend to be left behind, right? Because there's usually not somebody to come and connect with them in a way that meets them where they are, right? So we see all these terms evolve, new terms literally like every day, but it's not being translated or created in real time in
Yes.
indigenous languages. So go ahead, Mohamed, touch on
No,
that.
yes, I think you said something very important, created. So,
Mhm.
in most of those languages, modern languages, for example, French, English, whatever, German, most of the scientific concepts were created. So I
Mhm.
think one of the problems today with our own indigenous languages, we don't make enough effort to create those scientific concepts. For example,
Mm.
if I use the word computer, so
Mm.
you already guess that compute was existed, and
Yeah.
ER means something which computes something else.
Yes.
So
Yes.
this is an invented word, and we should do that. We should do that effort to invert
Absolutely.
those concepts in order to bring in our own languages
Yes.
those complex, because they are not so complex, those
No.
complex concepts.
Mhm.
And it is very important because I think it is the best way to bring modernity in our land,
Mm.
because a language is also the support of a culture, right?
Mm.
Bringing in the languages, those different concepts, we are just changing the way people think. If you
Yeah.
never heard about TV, you cannot even imagine that a TV can exist. Okay?
Mm.
As soon as we bring the word TV, the word I find biology, different concept around biology, you can think a different way and imagine a different reality. And if we do not bring in our languages those concepts, people in our country, even if they are not educated, if they
Mm.
already have in mind those concepts, they can really bring under mind another kind of reality. And that's very, very important.
Mm.
And you have to understand, when you speak a language, you don't only speak a language, you also think in that language.
Yes.
So, what you have to understand, when you speak a language, you speak with a set of words. Okay. As soon as we retrieve in your vocabulary one of these words, you can never think, build concept, build a reality, okay, without this word. Okay. So it's like you are decreasing your imagination, you are decreasing your capacity of build a new reality. That's very important. And there is also another way around. So speaking a languages means, so if you don't speak a languages, never ever ever you can also create reality. Okay. And when you speak a language, you can only bring on reality something that already exists in your language. So what I mean by that, for example, if I think in Africa, you already know that there is some words, okay, there are some words that only exist in African languages. Okay, so for example, I come from West Africa, we use the word sanankuya. There is not, so it is difficult to explain the concept, but that means, for example, it's a kind of joke between people in order to avoid conflict. Okay, there is a word for that, but you cannot express this idea in French, in German, and in English. So that means that, for example, a German or French never ever ever can imagine that reality, that concept. Okay, so speaking a language, you also try to create images, and it is very important to keep those images, those concepts in our own languages. Yeah, definitely.
Wow. Like, wow. That. Oh, you took it there. Yo, that was so powerful. Like the tying this idea of how we create reality by our words, right? Like, because that's why we see, people who are like avid readers, as I have come to discover Muhammad is, right? Like reading books, it really like is this idea of being able to fathom a reality in context of that idea being proposed in that literature, right? And whether that is like, like a translation from a real experience, or people, let's say, who write sci-fi or any kind of fiction where they're saying this is a potential reality that somebody could imagine, right? And even as you touched on, this concept of TV or computer or internet, because for me, I brought it all the way simply to even just some stuff that we say every day. But let's say maybe 20 years ago, somebody would be like, if somebody like time traveled to 20 years and you're speaking the same way you're speaking today, like, oh, just Google it. I'm going to Google this thing, or just tweet it, or somebody tweeted this thing, or it was on YouTube. Like, people will look at you like you're weird. Like, what is this person talking about? Right? But in our current lexicon, it's like, oh yeah, we know what a Google is, and Google is both a verb and a noun, right? Where people understand when you say, oh, I'll Google it, or go and Google and do this, or Facebook it, or DMs, slide in the DMs. Even today, the people who still don't understand because they're not, navigating those spaces of virtual connection or community creation, right? Because if they're not in the internet sphere, they're like, what is this DM? What is this sliding in a DM? What does that mean? And then try to explain that in our mother tongues. Like, oh, like, I don't know. So, going back to this idea of how we then make STEM more accessible, right? Because I keep having to remind people that just because something is available does not mean it's accessible to everybody. Right? These scientific approaches, scientific theories, and scientific discoveries, once they're discovered and made and publicized, whether it's in a paper or on TV or elsewhere in conferences, yes, it is available. But unless if you're connecting in those spaces, you will not know that it is accessible to you. If you even happen to have access to them, because sometimes you have to pay to even access those papers, right? So, understanding that, sometimes there are hindrances to modernizing our languages to meet this demand for like transference of knowledge, right? And whether sometimes that's intentional or not, we could totally debate about that. And that, to me, I'm like, that just brings back the importance of building like strong networks across the spectrum, right? Making sure that we are building like connectivity highways, so to speak, so that we're able to exchange that information, exchange the data in a way that crosses through these cultural like boundaries, so to speak.
Yeah.
Any feedback on that? Because I feel like you wanted to say something, Mohamed.
I would like to emphasize the.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. I would like to emphasize Grace's work because she's doing something very interesting. So translation.
Yes.
I think if we remember well, for example, in Europa, they switched from Latin to German, first to French, to Italian language and German. Okay, so to do that, the first step of this fight, because for me it is a fight, it's a cultural fight for us to move from French, English to our indigenous languages, is translation. Okay, so they translated many books from Latin to their languages, and this effort automatically create new words. Okay, so and that's, I think it is the first step, translation. And if you look at carefully, if you look at most of those indigenous languages, we do not translate enough. Translating is bring in our languages new concept, new ideas. For example, let's take the Bible. If you try to translate the Bible in our languages, I suppose that, for example, in some of our languages, the word angel does not exist. So you should try to first create a new word, okay? Or you try to overload the meaning of an existing word, okay?
Yes.
And I can take an example from my field, math. In math, for example, if I say ring means this one.
Yes.
And ring is also a mathematical concept.
Yes.
So when someone if you told me about a ring, I understand what is a ring. But if a mathematician say a ring, in my mind there is another image I create in my mind.
Yeah.
And for me, these two words they look the same, but they're not the same. Okay?
Yes.
And we should make this effort to overload the meaning of existing word in our languages in order to expand the vocabulary of our languages. Yeah.
Correct.
So translation, and I am going to let Grace to talk because what she's doing is exactly that, more or less. Yeah.
Absolutely. Go ahead, sis.
Well, first of all, thank you guys for the shout out. So I guess I had two things to kind of add to the points that you have mentioned. So the first was about allowing people to kind of build these imaginations, or giving people space for these imaginations to exist, and the role of language in that. So when I hear about imagination, the first thing that I think about is like knowledge creation. Because if you imagine from this aspect of a scientist, like half the battle, at least because I'm a life scientist, so I spend all my time thinking about the natural world, right? And in order for us to understand the natural world that we live in, we have to use our imagination, right? And then we have to be able to communicate and kind of engage with each other in order for these ideas to grow and to exist. And part of that has to do with like being able to see yourself as a knowledge producer instead of a knowledge consumer. And in order to do all that, you have to be able to kind of talk and interact and engage. So one reason why I at least value so much like creating these bridges between different Indigenous language speakers is I believe that like we shut out a really large part of humanity by not engaging their ways of knowledge and their ways of seeing and their ways of thinking, right? Because like as Mohamed said, like the way that if you think of that word for angel, the example he just gave, the way that someone in South Africa conceptualizes angel is not the same as someone in South America. But like the concept is the same. So if you take time to kind of see how they engage that concept, you learn quite a bit, I would argue, about the human condition just by seeing how they engage that concept. And so how much more about the human body, about the world that we live in, would we understand if we did that with many Indigenous languages, right? So I don't know. So that's part of why I care about this so much. So again, as I mentioned, I started my YouTube channel because I wanted my grandparents to be able to keep up with like the developments in the coronavirus and COVID discovery, just because, so science, if you are a scientist, you definitely understand that science evolves and grows and is very dynamic. And I think we saw that with the coronavirus pandemic, the way it started and everything was changing. You were being told, yes, mask, no mask, like it was a lot. But that's kind of normal, right? Because science grows and evolves. And as scientists, you have to kind of change your way of thinking based on the data that's at hand. And of course, all of that was not captured in many, many language communities. And so then that kind of ties back to the idea of like, who is the knowledge producer? Who is the knowledge consumer? Who is being left out as a passive consumer? And why are we not taking advantage of people's imagination, people's capacity, people's ability to engage and understand the world that we all share, right? So I don't know. So that's part of like the heart behind why I do what I do. And that's also why it resonates with me a lot when you guys talk about imagination and giving people the chance to imagine and to see themselves in this world, right? And again, like people are not just passive, just sitting there, right? So we just need to be able to, I think, give people the space to imagine and then give people the space to speak and to engage and to communicate. And I don't know if this is naive, but I would argue that our understanding of our world, of our communities, of our galaxy would be a little bit richer and deeper if we allowed for those voices to be heard and if their knowledge was integrated into like the larger body. So yeah.
Oh, like listen, I could sit here and just let you guys go, because this is like, oh, this is a lot, you know, like because oh man, you like I really love the fact that you also tagged on this idea of the language consumers versus creators, or information consumers versus creators, right? And it really also for me, even STEM professionals, right, or even professional in whatever arena you happen to work in, people oftentimes limit themselves to simply what that title is. Oh, I'm a mathematician, so I can only talk about mathematics. I'm a civil engineer, so I can only talk about this particular concept that I work in the professional designation. I'm whatever it is. But like even like here, like at the end of the day, what we all really like the common core is we recognize that there's a need to, really connect back what we do on the continent to the larger diaspora, but also to the larger community, to be able to own our narrative. Because that's what it comes down to, is how do we regain back the narrative that oftentimes gets told on our behalf about us from an outsider's perspective. That's really the journey of what we're really embarking on. Is we're saying, okay, somebody else has been telling our story in a language that we don't even understand oftentimes, right? And that's how the story oftentimes gets mistranslated, if I could say that, right? Where, where you say one thing, because even I see it sometimes in translations, where the person says one thing, and if you happen to understand that Indigenous language and you hear what the translation is, sometimes it doesn't quite fit. Actually, a lot of times it doesn't quite fit, because the intensity of the meaning is lost also in the process, right? And when we do that to people who speak a particular language, and I don't know if it was you, Mohamed, who said it, or Grace, when it's when the translations are coming from a person who doesn't indigenously speak it, there's also a very different connection to it. Like you end up translating it differently, right? And so it is very important to, again, include in that process people who are indigenous to that language, right? Because it's a very different understanding and connection to the language and connection to the culture, because language has both cultural, has both that verbal context, that but as well as a cultural context, right? Where you bring in the customs and culture of those people as a community, right? So even Grace, as you're talking about, making sure that your grandmother could understand it in a language that is of ease to her. It's all you end up educating all those people around her and around the community who happen to understand that dialect, right? And so, like, to me, that's why we do this, right? Is to help bridge those connections along the way, hopefully. Where because for me it was how do I help make STEM practical, right? Because oftentimes people are scared of STEM, because like, oh my God, that is hard, that is tough. Engineering, mathematics, I don't know about that. Science, but I'm like, when we begin to make the technical practical and allow people to see themselves, and that's the thing that you both have said is, when we begin to see ourselves in the stories that are written about us as a people, we then begin to reimagine, like, oh, I could write my own story. I can write about how my people evolve and move around through time in these experiences, right? So now what you're like, Grace, what you're doing is like the evolution of people navigating through COVID, right? And that could also be then translated to any other similar concept of, let's say, pandemic or epidemic experiences, right? You're helping to create a language that helps folks relate in similar circumstances that may not necessarily have to be specifically COVID, right? And so that's really where I want us to get to, where we're able to A, make the technical practical, but B, make it relevant and relatable to people wherever they are, where they don't have to first go learn English or learn French or learn German to simply be able to understand concepts that affect them in a very practical manner. Any feedback on that? I've ranted a lot. No? Okay, cool. All right. So we will move forward. No, you have something? Go ahead.
Yeah, so this actually has to do with a conversation that I've heard in this field about this idea of like deficit perspective, of always thinking that like the community that we're serving somehow doesn't know and that we're somehow like serving them. And I just want to clarify that like it's not that I think somebody doesn't know something.
No.
It's like I want to kind of bridge a gap and help invite people who may have been historically excluded for many reasons that I know are not this particular discussion, because we can be here all day if we try to talk about that topic.
Okay.
But like, when you really think about it, it's not so much about, you don't know, so let me tell you. It's more like, whoever is generating this knowledge may not have considered that you might need interpretation, not because you understand, but like that the way that you live your life does not necessarily match exactly. So the problem isn't you need to switch to my way of life. It's just, we need to find a way to talk with each other. So it's like a two-way conversation, I think. And that's kind of going back to the example that Mohamed had about that interpretation of that word angel. It's not to say that like, we're trying to make it practical for whoever, kind of like what you said, when you were trying to make it practical, because you can talk to someone about an angel all day long, but if they don't understand what that means in their way of life and in their history, it means nothing. Yes. So then when, like, what are they gonna how are they gonna contextualize what that word means for them? They won't. And so then it's a waste of your time, because you're giving them something else that's abstract. And then when you want them to kind of engage with what you're talking about, they can't do it because they don't have a connection with it. And I would argue, actually, I think this is the hill that I will personally die on. I believe that science is relevant to everybody, because everyone is engaged and engaging with science all the time, full time. So all of this business of, science is really hard, chemistry is really hard, it's because they're bad teachers, but that's a separate conversation. So I feel that one thing that we can try and do is, if we can try and at least bridge the language gap, then we make space for multiple ways of people like understanding some of these concepts and engaging with these concepts, and ultimately producing some of this knowledge, So I think that's like, at least for me, again, that's like the crux of why I care so much, is it's not just let me tell you so that you just sit here and, like, I feel like for me, I would consider all of my efforts a failure if in 10 years I'm still the only person doing this. That would be a complete failure, 100%. What would be a really amazing thing is if other people start to do this in their Indigenous languages, or other people start doing it in my Indigenous language and do it better, and like keep pushing this forward, so that we can kind of create this like science literate environment, so that when you are hearing someone talking about viruses, it's not just some obscure topic. And I think it's important, like in a little village in Kenya, in a little village in the middle of Guinea, I would think that it would be amazing if everyone kind of understood and could be able to relate to all of these topics. And hope, like in my world, I imagine that like these are some people who could contribute to understanding of all of these systems, because we certainly we have not solved all the problems. In fact, we have more problems than we have solutions. So these are opportunities for integrating more solution bearers and solution creators. So that's like, so I just wanted to clarify that, because I don't want to get stuck in this deficit thinking of it's only me donating. Yeah, I'm just a random grad student making this content, but I know that like there's many other people who can do the same, and ideally other people will be able to kind of grow from this and engage. It's like a two-way conversation. Sorry, I just needed to add that on.
Yes, thank you, Grace, for saying that, because you have in parallel two worlds, sorry. The first world is people who speak French, German, English, so Western languages, okay. And you have another world, and unfortunately, the people from the first group tend to think that the people of the second group are stupid, they don't understand things, and people highly educated tend to avoid and do not speak at all to those second group of people. Okay, so there is no bridge, there is a big gap, and every day this gap is increasing every day. Okay,
speak on it.
Because we do not science. When we make science, we should also spread science. And in Africa, unfortunately, we don't have in mind that, I think, creating knowledge, creating science is important, right? But we should also, as scientists, also try to spread more and more those science. And there is a lack of that in Africa, really. African scientists, they live in the lab, in the laboratories, and they never, ever try to bring on table those concepts and those those ideas. So there is a gap between those two people. And also, as those people, we tend to think that those people are stupid. And then there is, in everyday life, new ideas, new concepts in science. And so those people who don't at all speak Western language, they tend to ignore, to avoid modernity. Okay, so they really think that modernity is for foreigner, is for white people. Okay, so there is a clash, a fight between two kinds of Africans. The first group who really think that the second group is stupid, and the second group who really think that modernity is not at all for them. And I think we have a burden to really bring on table those concepts and to try to be modest, to be humble, in order to in everyday life try to talk to those people and create this bridge. That's very, very important for me. Yeah, definitely.
Man, you have touched on something really key here. Oh, okay. I'll go back to Grace, then I'll jump on what you said. The first thing I really do want us to get, and I'll probably keep repeating this, right? We're not doing anybody any favors by simply increasing accessibility to the knowledge that we know. We're not doing folks any favors, because oftentimes they already know these concepts, but in a very intrinsic, natural manner. All we're doing is adding scientific backing to concepts that already exist in nature, right? And so and if anything, we're helping folks have a better language of exchanging information. So I'm really glad that Grace, brought that up and made it very clear that we're not doing folks any favors by creating this content and allowing them to be receivers, but also in the process of us creating, we're also inspiring others to also be content creators, right? Lexicon, creators, enhancers of whatever our vernacular language happens to be, right? So that's step one. But also this other concept that Mohamed touched on very kindly is this idea of gatekeeping in a way, right? And how not only the Western world tends to, how it looks at our Indigenous folks and our Indigenous languages, but it's also how we also then internalize that classist ideology, right? And really, like, the general concept is, I guess, the respectability politics of it. And for those who may not be familiar, I will do a quick rundown into it, right? Respectability politics is a tactic used to get a seat at the table to work with those in power, oftentimes, right? So it goes back to this idea that there is also a power struggle in respectability politics, in the person who hoards information and access to power via that information. So respectability politics is this ideology that is based on respectability narratives, which are representations of marginalized individuals meant to depict them as sharing similar traits, values, and morals that align with those of the dominant culture's definition of what is respectable, what is good, what is acceptable, and all that good jazz, right? So it's, at the end of the day, it's somebody else getting to define what your lived experience ought to look and feel and be like expressed as, right? So, and I'm glad that, like, really, Mohamed, I don't know if you meant to do this, but like, you so easily, not only called out that it happens from an outside perspective looking in to the continent, but we also do it to ourselves. Oftentimes, perpetuating this gatekeeping concept of, in order to be respected, or in order to be the voice of the people, right? To educate Grace, in order for you to even be able to speak on COVID, like, you have to have X degree. You have to have, this kind of title. You have to have these many years doing this work. Like, in order for me to speak on engineering or like STEM across, African culture, like, I have to have all these things and all these credentials after my name for me to even touch on a topic. Not recognizing that, hold up, we have our own scientists back home. We have our own engineers. We have our own journalists, our own creatives, But oftentimes we don't give them the same credence as somebody who's left and then come back. And there's something to be said of that, right? And that's how, people come back and they're like from trips abroad for 3 months, like, I don't understand Kiswahili. No, it's no longer in me. People leave for a month or two and they've forgotten their mother tongue. And they think that that's something to be proud of, right? And the reality is, like, you're disconnecting yourself from a great opportunity to come back and educate those who didn't have the opportunity to expand their knowledge elsewhere, right? And connect back to that. So both of y'all are thinking, so
No,
go.
what you said, gatekeeper, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay. You have to understand something. In modern world,
Mm-hmm.
knowledge is power.
Yes.
Okay, and it is quite important. And there is a French philosopher, Michel Foucault, who really proved that. So if you have the knowledge, you have the power. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but in our all African society, I think it is age. So more you're old, more you are the power. So we have to switch from this old kind of thinking to this new one. Okay, and also even if you have the power, you as African, we should be humble, be modest, because we can still learn from all the African, because they have different kind of knowledge, okay? And we should try to interpret this knowledge with a modern perspective, okay? And I think I sent to Grace a few days ago a short paper about scientific dependence in Africa. And the writer of this paper, his name is Paulin Ontunji. He's from Benin, and he's a philosopher. And he wrote several papers about that. Okay, so trying to study the African techniques in order to try to look at the modern perspective in those old techniques. Because I think most of all African people, they use techniques, but they don't use maybe the perspective of modernity of those techniques. So we should try also as scientists to study also these techniques in our continent. And I would like also to say another kind of thing is about the production of knowledge in STEM. So as we produce knowledge in Western languages, okay, we are a little bit late in this production. Let me explain that. So today we don't have enough scientists in Africa. We do not produce enough scientists because we produce scientists in Western language. So we have many Africans today. They're born in another kind of language, okay? They cannot be scientists because science is produced and spread in a different kind of language. So they are totally foreigner of science. So bringing in our language science, we can have more scientists in Africa in order to produce more knowledge in STEAM. And I think that's why I think really European shift from Latin to French to German, because as soon as you do that, you can have many more people who are able to produce science in their language. And today it is very important. It's a fight. It's really a big fight for us to really bring on table more scientists in order to produce more knowledge, in order to change the vocabulary even. So because, for example, if you take math, you already heard about Pythagorean theorem, right? So imagine Winnie theorem, imagine Grace theorem, Kago theorem. So using those words, okay, to call, for example, a principle of science, we are also trying to Africanize the science. Because today the word of science is a Western name word. So we should also use our name, our word in science, is also to bring also Africa in science and science in Africa, to mix those two kind of words. Yeah, definitely.
Well, absolutely. No, you want to jump, Grace? Go ahead. Yes, I was just like really into this.
So actually, I'm kind of hopping on to the exact point that Mohamed made, again, to do with this idea of like knowledge ownership. I would posit that also cultivating a culture of like knowledge ownership might also make it easier for So when you consider who funds science, right, there's an element of government funding that we have to always concede with, regardless of where we are in the world, right? So if I imagine having a conversation with like a member of parliament or an MCA, and I want them to fund my science, are they going to fund my science if they don't have an intimate understanding of it, or if it for them they just think it's like this foreign thing? You know, like, so one example that I've seen before here in the United States actually is there was someone who was trying to explain to a politician about this worm. So one of the model organisms that we use in biology is called C. elegans, and it's a worm. It's like this nematode. But the cool thing is that there's a lot of neurobiology and neuroscience that has been discovered about our neural system from just studying that worm. So from the world of science, like, we understand, okay, this is why this model organism is super important. But if you are trying to explain this to someone who doesn't have like the background or hasn't spent the time understanding the background, it's very easy for them to dismiss it, right? And so part of me, I don't know if this is naive thinking, but part of me wonders if some of these members of parliament, if some of these politicians, if they had the opportunity to truly fall in love with science, or like at least understand it intimately, would it be so hard for them to fund science, or to be convinced that they need to spend their income or their resources on developing science institutions? Like, would it be so? I would argue that it wouldn't be hard. I think that that would increase the chances of getting more support to build scientists on the continent. Because unfortunately, at the end of the day, we know that money moves things. And so the question is, how do we get more money into this institution? And the answer is not Western funding sources. Okay, so I was born in Kenya. I know I live in the West. I know I'm a Westerner by all standards, but I'm telling you, Western funding sources isn't the answer. The answer is prioritizing research from the continent, on the continent, funded by the continent. And part of that is like convincing people that this is important, this is tangible, and you have a stake in this, you know? And again, I don't know if I'm just naive, but I think that if we can get more people who have a stake in the knowledge and knowledge production, then I would argue that some of these hurdles will not be so challenging or so abstract. And it will not be so challenging to talk about building vaccine factories or trying to convince people that they need to develop the waterways so that we can have competitive manufacturing factories. Like, I would argue that, yes, there's a big element of corruption that impedes this progress, but I think that there's a portion of lack of ownership, lack of, I don't know, is it agency? Like, basically, if you don't see yourself as part of it, you will not bother with it. So I would argue that sometimes languages make you see yourself as part of it.
That is whew, right. It really goes. We're really bringing it full circle here, right? Being able to remind people who they are, but more importantly, allowing people to be seen in innovation and modernization of society, right? Because that's part of what has kept people feeling like they're forgotten, is they don't see themselves in this evolution of modernization, right? And so, in order to make sure that we not only make the information relevant but also relatable while still modernizing it as well in the process, like, we really have to take a step back and, I guess, get political buy-in from our leadership, right? Make sure that they see the importance of why science, why STEM, like, why do these things matter on a local perspective? Yeah. To me, I'm like, there's nothing more I can add to that. Like, y'all really captured it in a very, man, we went deep, but also still kept it so relatable. So first of all, I want to thank you guys, because I know we're running down on time here. But first and foremost, thank you for making time today, and I hope that you will come back again to African Engineering News. Because fam, there was like, we lightly touched on topics here that we could literally delve in like for future sessions, literally just on one topic, whether it's respectability politics, whether it's that age thing, whether it's the power of knowledge or access to power through knowledge, or lack thereof. Whether it's, how do we go about creating our own universities, right? That are created by us, funded by us, because oftentimes funding comes with ties of, okay, who gets to control the narrative of what you produce? That's the reality of it, right? And that's why also, I guess sometimes people are scared to get funding from certain sources because they know the responsibility that comes along with it. So I would like to give each of you at least 1 minute to close us out before I say goodbye to our viewers out there. Please let them know how they can connect with you, or if you have any interesting projects that you want them to know of, please do include that as well. So we'll start again with Grace and then Mohamed, and I'll close us out.
All right. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I think for me, so I have a YouTube platform. Wait, can you hear me? Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So I have a YouTube platform where I try and have conversations in the Gikuyu language. I will link myself, I think, probably, so I don't have any really social media except for the YouTube page. So what I'll do is I'll link myself to this YouTube, to African Engineering News' YouTube stream. So that's where you can kind of connect with me, and I hope to meet y'all and meet other people who are doing the same thing. Because again, this is not just, so I know we focus on Africa, but this is a problem that we've seen in Latin America, we've seen this in Asia. So this idea of like indigenous language retention is super important, and it is universal. And we need to kind of embrace all these different languages and move forward together. So yeah, that's my like closing thing. So yeah, thank you again, Winnie, for this opportunity. It's really nice to be here, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. And you're always welcome. Please know they're going to be back. I am already saying they're going to be back. We hope they will. But Mohamed, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Winnie. Thank you, Grace, for this great conversation. I learned a lot, really. I learned a lot. And I would like just to say two things. First of all, please speak your mother tongue. Speak Swahili, Kikuyu, Manding, whatever language, Yoruba, whatever. It's very, very important to save those languages. And second thing, please join ADSF if you are a PhD student, whatever, and you are trying to bring in Africa many African scientists in order to help people there to popularize science in Africa. So please, ADSF, I think Winnie will send you the link below. So please join ADSF, please. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, team. Thank you. And so, fam, as you've seen, like there's so much to learn. There's so much to do with our indigenous languages. And please be sure to check out links. Will be in the comment section. They'll be in the description. So you have no excuses. Again, I thank you for your time today. And if you're watching not on live session, please stay connected with us. Join on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, all that good stuff, as you can see down here. That's at africaengineeringnews.com, or you can connect directly to the website. That's at www.africaengineeringnews.com. Okay, until next time. Oh, also, before I forget, there'll be 2 links as well in the form. One is for African literature. If you have a particular book or a literature form that you would like for us to share with our platform viewers, please do drop it, complete the form. The other one is if you would like to be a guest on a future Own the Narrative Africa session, or if you know somebody who should be a guest, include their information, fill out the form. And so again, check it out in the comment section. More information to come in the future. And again, I thank each and every one of you for your time today. Have a wonderful week ahead, and we'll catch you on the next Own the Narrative Africa with Winnie O. Bye, guys. Yay.